There are many ways of talking about the past in French, and today we're going to look very specifically at the perfect tense, and even more specifically the perfect tense using the verb avoir. Now in English, we have three different ways of talking about events in the past. I played, I have played, and I did play. Now the good news for students of French is that all three of those phrases can be translated using the same sentence. It really does mean that French is, actually in this case, quite easy. Now the French word for this is le passé composé, and it's made in French in three really easy steps. Firstly, you need to find the verb that you need. Secondly, you change the way that the verb is written. And finally, you add a part of the verb avoir with its subject pronoun. And before we get confused about these grammatical terms, that simply means I, you, he, she, we, or they. So firstly, let's look at the first step, finding the verb that you're looking for. In order to do that, we obviously need a very, very crucial piece of kit for any language learner, the dictionary. To make the sentence I have played, firstly we're going to look at play in the dictionary. That's in its infinitive form. We find the word we're looking for next to the letters VI or VT. We don't need to worry at the moment what the I and the T stand for. And in some dictionaries, particularly newer ones, you often just see the word verb written next to it. Now that's really important because sometimes when we're looking at these words, we find the noun, for example, the play that you see on a stage. So it's really important that we actually find the one we really want. And in this case, the word we find is jouer. Now, lots of infinitives, about 90% of them in the French language, end with letters ER, for example, jouer or parler, the verb to speak. And in order to make that useful for the perfect tense, the first thing we have to do is change the ending of that word. So for ER verbs, jouer or parler, the first thing we do is we take off the ER. That creates what we call a stem, the jou. Secondly, we put an E accent acute on the end. That turns the sound from joue to jouer. And you've just changed the infinitive into what we now call, or what grammarians call, a past participle. But what about other verb forms? Because not all verbs in the French language end with letters ER. Some of them end with letters IR. You must have seen finir, the verb to finish, or alternatively verbs ending RE, like vendre, the verb to sell. In both cases, it's not different from the ER verbs. It's the same process, but this time the endings are somewhat different. For an IR verb like finir, we take off our IR, but this time, instead of adding an E with an accent, we add the letter I. So fin becomes fini. For RE verbs like vendre, again we take off our RE and create vend, and this time we add the letter U, vendu. So to summarize, how do you think the following verbs will change into past participles? Looking at the verb parler, to speak, the first thing we notice it ends with the letters ER. So we take off the ER and we add an E with an accent. Parler sounds the same, but it's spelled differently. Parler. Manger, again, it ends with the letters ER. So what do you think you're going to do? That's right. You take off the ER and you add an E with an accent. Manger becomes manger. But again, it's just spelt that little bit differently. Now, choisir doesn't end with an ER. So what do you think you're going to do this time? Correct. You're going to take off your IR and you're going to add the letter I. Choisi. And this time we notice with attendre that it ends with an RE. Can you remember the rule for changing the RE on an RE verb? That's right. You add a U. So attendre becomes attendu. So to summarize this step one more time, infinitives ending ER become E with an accent, IR become I, and RE replace the RE with a U. However, there are some exceptions that need to be learned, but we're not going to look at those today. We're going to concentrate on the more straightforward forms. We're now only one step away from being able to make the perfect tense in French. The final step involves using a part of the verb avoir, that's the verb to have. Now hopefully you've been learning this right the way from your first years of French, so this should be quite familiar to you. Here's the verb in English, and here's the verb in French. J'ai, tu as, il ou elle a, nous avons, vous avez, il ou elle on. Now we're ready to make sentences in the perfect tense. And again, we're going to follow this in these 3 easy steps. If we want to translate I have played, the first thing we do is we find our infinitive. Now remember, that's the verb you find in the dictionary. We already know that from before. It was jouer. Secondly, we change it into a past participle. We take off the er and we add an e with an accent. And now here's the crucial third stage. We add avoir. J'ai joué. That means I have played. But don't forget, it also means I played and I did play. So here's a few things just to bear in mind when we're actually going over the perfect tense with avoir. Here's the 2 mistakes I see most often when students are actually trying to speak this language. The perfect tense always has 3 parts: subject, part of avoir, and a past participle. And often I've seen work where students have written I played, forgetting that actually the part of avoir still needs to be there. Hence I see je jouais, when in fact it should be j'ai joué. And the other mistake I often see quite a lot is when they're not using the perfect tense, but actually using it in the present tense. They think that j'ai means I have. They think that j'ai means I, when in actual fact it means I have. It should never be used to mean I alone in the present tense. And you should know that, because you know it is just simply je. So, here's a checklist. Have you found the correct infinitive? Have you changed it to a past participle? Have you added the correct part of avoir? And are there 2 verbs in your French translation? A past participle and a part of avoir. Next steps, well, there's 3 more things we're going to need to look at in the future about the perfect tense. Firstly, some verbs don't follow ER, IR and RE patterns, and we're just going to have to go and learn them as we go along. Secondly, there's a very small group of verbs that form the perfect tense with être instead of avoir, but again, we'll look at those in another session. And finally, we're also going to need to look at some reflexive verbs. But hopefully now you've got a handle on how to do perfect tense with avoir.